Good morning and welcome to the Peoria. I'm your host, Paul Gordon. Every year, it seems, the Illinois General Assembly struggles to get a new budget approved before the June 1 deadline. Often, overtime is required because the budget talks become so contentious. Not so this year. A spending plan was approved and the spring session ended on time. But does that mean the session was successful? Not completely. By most accounts, pension reform was the top priority heading into the session, and it did not get done. But we do record this program in advance, so it's possible that Governor Pat Quinn and legislative leaders were able to work things out in a special session before this broadcast. I have my doubts. What about the other legislation that was adopted or rejected by the General Assembly? Was the package that some labeled as Medicaid reform really reformation at all? Will it have to be revisited in the next year or two? What is the most objectionable part to raising taxes on tobacco, the main cog of the Medicaid rescue package? Will gambling expansion become law this year or be vetoed? At what point does it reach saturation? And finally, what's coming next in Springfield? State Senator Darin LaHood is my guest today, and the Peoria Republican and I will discuss these issues when we come back. Welcome back to the Peorian. My guest today is State Senator Darin LaHood, and our topic is the recent spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
How would you rate this recent spring session? Would you rate it a success, a disappointment? Can it even be rated in those kind of terms?
Yeah. Well, this was my first full session because I've just been in office for about 15 months. And looking at this first full session, you know, I was disappointed in some things, but overall I'd probably give it a 3 or a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay.
You know, I think there was a lot of optimism going into the session with what we had to do. There was a lot of good negotiation going on, bipartisan between both parties, particularly on pension reform, Medicaid reform, on our budget. And out of those three, budget, pension, and Medicaid reform, you know, the only thing we ended up reaching a bipartisan agreement on was Medicaid, which was substantial. I think will put us on the path, at least with Medicaid, to fiscal solvency with that program in our state. But unfortunately, with budget and pensions, we fell short at the end there. And so anyway, I think we were a third of the way there, but we fell short on those other two items.
When you say you fell short on the budget, you did approve a spending plan.
We did, but it was a very partisan budget. There was no Republican support in the House or Senate for the budget that ended up passing. Part of that was because it increased spending, and much of the negotiation that went on with Republicans and Democrats at the very end, you know, that fell apart, and there was really no Republican support for that. Even though many of the things that we had worked on were in there, at the end they increased the spending at a level that we just could not support.
What do you believe was the most significant piece of legislation that did come out?
Yeah, I think obviously the Medicaid reform was substantial. And by way of background, you know, Medicaid has really exploded in Illinois. 1 of every 2 births is Medicaid now in Illinois. 1 of every 4 people in Illinois is on some type of Medicaid.
Wow.
And so when you look at that explosion in our state, that had to be curtailed. And so we ended up reaching a compromise and a bill that cut about 1.6 billion out of the Medicaid budget for next year, which was absolutely significant. And it wasn't easy to do. Obviously, Medicaid, you know, is health care for a lot of our poorer citizens, but it needed to be done because with our budget deficit of $9 billion, a big portion of that is our Medicaid spending. So that was a bipartisan resolution. There weren't, you know, there were some Democrats that didn't support that, particularly in our urban areas. Some of our Republicans didn't like the idea of some of these cuts, but it had to be done. In the end, we reached a resolution on that. So I think that was the most substantial item that we accomplished.
Medicaid was significant. Medicaid rescue was significant. But you disagreed with at least one of the components of the Medicaid rescue package, and that being
cigarette tax.
Cigarette tax. Can you tell us why?
Yeah. So we had a bill that would increase cigarette tax by $1 per pack. I voted against that. And the reason why I voted against it was, I think in our state we have a revenue problem. I'm sorry, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem in our state. And if you look at, we had the largest tax increase in our history that went into effect in January of 2011, brought in $8 billion more into our coffers into Illinois than we had the year before. And at the time, the Democrats argued at the time, let's get this tax increase, it'll put us on the path to fiscal solvency, bring down our debt, pay off our bills. Well, we did that, none of that happened. We still have the same amount of debt, same unpaid bills. My point being, we keep raising taxes after taxes, and that's not the problem. We have to curtail spending. So on the cigarette tax, I may have been more supportive of that if we had firm spending caps in place, cuts in place, that would really put us on the path to fiscal solvency. When you got a $9 billion deficit, Paul, I don't think increasing revenue is the way to get there.
You got a lot of thank yous from tobacco users, tobacco lobbies, whatever, for your opposition to raising the cigarette tax by $1. But wasn't there gratitude misplaced a little bit? You weren't voting against that to help out the tobacco users.
That's correct. I was voting on the principle of increasing taxes, really. And from that standpoint, people can congratulate me for a lot of different reasons on why they think I voted against, but really it was on that core principle of raising taxes. I think, again, we got a spending problem, not a revenue problem, right. And increasing taxes, whatever it is, we shouldn't be looking at that until we have, our budget in place. Obviously, if we had a balanced budget and a surplus, we wouldn't be looking at the cigarette tax or any other taxes.
Okay. When we come back, we're going to talk further about some of this past session's legislation and what it will mean to taxpayers in the future. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to the Peoria. I'm with State Senator Darin LaHood. Senator, compare this spring session, if you would, with the last spring session. And I do understand that you did not serve the entire spring session in 2011, but you were there for the nitty-gritty.
Yeah. Well, I think the financial hurdles that our state faces right now, that's what everybody focused on this session. And if you think about it, last October, Moody's Financial Rating Service dropped Illinois to the lowest credit rating in the entire country. So we're 50 out of 50 in terms of our credit rating and our bond rating in this state. And I think that sent shockwaves through our state, from Chicago all the way down to southern Illinois. So the emphasis on getting our budget in line and taking care of our fiscal problems, was really the emphasis this cycle. And in that analysis, when Moody's downgraded us, they said the specific inability of our legislature to tackle these fiscal issues is the reason why we're downgraded. And I think people are very, very concerned about that. And so this session, really focusing on those fiscal matters, not as much on social matters, but, the two biggest expenditures in our budget are, pensions, Medicaid, and then thirdly, education. And so, it was a very, very tough session in terms of finding out where we make those spending cuts, how we do that, figuring out programs that work, keep those going, but, cutting back on spending, and nobody likes that. I think, these jobs, state senator and state rep 20 years ago, it was a lot of ribbon cuttings and figuring out where to spend money. Now it's a lot of telling people no, and given the fiscal reality of, we have to cut. And it's hard for people, my constituents, to understand when in your own family finances, if you don't have enough money coming in, what do? Well, you cut back, you get rid of a second car, you don't take a vacation, you cut back on your grocery bill. We haven't done that in the state, and so I think it's extremely frustrating for people to not understand that. They want us to go there, put us on this path to fiscal solvency by cutting spending and getting back to basics.
How big a deal was it in the grand scheme of things to abolish tuition waivers and legislative scholarships?
Yeah, I think it should have happened a long time ago. I made a decision when I first came into office not to give out legislative scholarships. By eliminating this, the governor will sign it. I think it's a wonderful thing. We save about $14 million a year, first of all, small in terms of our big budget. But secondly, it's symbolic. It's really a legislative perk to be able to give out legislative scholarships to people in your district that then go to a state university, and it's not really free because the taxpayers have to pick that up. The universities have to pick up that free tuition. So I'm glad I voted to eliminate it. I was the co-sponsor of the bill. And the other thing is, what happened with this program, Paul, over the last 10 or so years was it was really abused. Right now, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago is investigating 2 members of the House that were abusing this system. It's turned out that a lot of these scholarships have gone to political donors. There's been corruption involved with selling some of these. So it was time that we send a message that, this type of legislative perk, while it may be small, it's a start to what I believe we need: more transparency, more ethical legislation in our state, particularly after we've had 2 former governors that now sit in federal prison. We got an indicted state rep that allegedly took $7,000 just 2 months ago. And, the University of Illinois just came out with a study in February that said Chicago is the most corrupt city in the country, and Illinois was the 3rd most corrupt state. That's just not a reputation that we should be proud of in any way, and need to reverse that. This is one small way to do that.
Quickly, the governor has not, at the time of this recording, had not yet signed the legislation to expand gambling and is indicating he may not. At what point do we reach saturation as far as gambling goes?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to realize where we're at with gambling. We currently have 10 casinos in this state right now. This bill that I voted against would expand that to almost 20 in the state. Would put slots in racetracks. And let's remember, the video poker is about ready to go online here in the next couple of weeks, which will be in lots of bars and taverns and restaurants around the state. We now have lottery that's gone online. So, from my point of view, enough is enough in gambling. I think it's a lot of false promises. When you look at the saturation level, I agree with Governor Quinn on this. He said he didn't want to turn Illinois into the Las Vegas of the Midwest. And I think that's unfortunately the road we're headed down. And so I did not support it. I think it creates more problems than it does solutions, and I don't think it's good public policy.
Okay. We're going to take a break now for word from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the issues the General Assembly may see soon. But first, here's the Peorian's Kevin Kaiser to tell us what is happening in the culinary and literary world.
What's up, homies? This week it's another very special episode of Kevin Reads Stuff So You Don't Have To, Classics Edition. Last time it was Don Quixote by Cervantes, and this time it's Bleak House by Charles Dickens, another massive novel by another massive author. It's true, the novel is massive at over 1,000 pages, and the author was massive as well. Legend has it Dickens was 8 feet tall and weighed 300 pounds. When he was just 7 months old, he sawed the legs off his parents' bed at night, and when he was older, with his faithful Blue Ox Babe by his side, he dug the Grand Canyon by dragging his axe behind him. And along the way, he wrote some of the greatest novels in the English language. And Bleak House is considered to be his masterpiece. But it's something I wouldn't recommend to most people. I mean, it's 1,000 pages. But that's why I'm here, I guess. The story centers around a decade-long court proceeding. I know what you're saying, 1,000 pages on a lawsuit, count me in. But anyway, the lawsuit relates to an inheritance that's slowly being eaten away by the court case itself. Dickens presents an unforgettable cast of characters, including Mr. Bucket, one of the first detectives in English fiction. In fact, Bleak House, while it touches on a variety of genres, is considered to be the first detective novel. Other characters include Mrs. Telby, a satirical caricature of the liberal do-gooder, the beautiful Lady Dedlock, who keeps secrets about a lost love and a lost child, and the heroine of the novel, Esther Summerson, who is a potential benefactor of the inheritance. The novel is a combination of detective story, romance, melodrama, and satire, otherwise known as a detect-rom mellotire. It's actually based on a real-life case, and Bleak House helped expose problems that were emblematic of the British legal system at the time. In fact, the novel, thanks to its satirical treatment, helped spur legal reform in the 1870s. While it's 1,000 pages long, it's a brisk 1,000 pages, if that's possible. But Bleak House wasn't even published as a novel originally. It appeared in 20 monthly installments in newspapers between March of 1852 and September of 1853. All told, it contains 67 chapters, which, if you do the math, works out to an average of 12.2686567 pages per chapter, which isn't too shabby. So if you read a chapter a week, you could be done in, oh God, over a year. It would take a year, which is why I read this book for you. So there you have it, another very special episode of Kevin Reads Stuff So You Don't Have To, Classics Edition. And as always, you are welcome.
We're back with State Senator Darin LaHood. Senator, what are some of the issues you expect to come up in the near future, perhaps as early as the fall session?
Yeah, I think, pension reform, we worked very, very hard on this last session. That's an essential part of what we need to do to reform our state government. So I'm hopeful either later on this summer or in the fall, we get to, vote on pension reform. And if you think about it, Illinois is really an island on this issue. Every other state around us has reformed their state pension system and made the necessary changes to, again, put us on the path to fiscal solvency. If you think about the largest tax increase in our history that went into effect, I mentioned brought in $8 billion. That $8 billion that we brought in went to two things: to make our pension payment on time, about $6 billion, and the other $2 billion to Medicaid. So that pension payment is going to continue to grow. It's really an anchor around our neck fiscally, and if we do not address it, that portion of the budget is continue to grow and grow and grow. And so, I give the governor some credit. He put forth some bold proposals, raising the retirement age, talking about added contributions from state workers and from people that currently get pensions. What I've said all along is we have to have a pension reform that's fair and equitable, taking into account state workers, teachers that signed up under a contract where they understood what the state was going to do for them and what they were going to do for the state and their job. And so, there's constitutional issues to look at. However, in the big picture, we're going to continue to head towards this fiscal cliff if we don't address pension reform. So there's a number of proposals on the table, giving people an option if you're in a pension to either get your COLA or to get health care. And again, that was the proposal that Speaker Madigan had come up with at the very end with the Republicans. It fell apart because they wanted to push a lot of those costs on the downstate teacher system, which I didn't necessarily agree with, didn't think that was the right way to go. So, because in a way, really what they're pushing their problems onto the locals. So, pension reform has to happen. I think we'll get there. We have to, because these credit rating agencies are no longer going to continue where we're at. They're going to drop us even lower to possibly bankruptcy status if we don't address the pension issue.
There's a renewed push, or at least a heavier push, to legalize same-sex marriage in Illinois and pretty much across the country. Some believe that it's inevitable that it's going to happen. What's your stand on that?
Well, one thing that concerns me is when the civil unions law passed in Illinois before I came into the legislature, there was a promise at the time that Catholic charities and other groups would be exempted from that. And Catholic charities relied upon that. And what concerns me is those promises that were made at the time with the civil unions law would have allowed Catholic charities to continue to do the work that they do, taking care of the most vulnerable in our community and our state. That ended up not happening and caused a lot of concern in the Catholic community, Lutheran social services, and lots of other ones. So in terms of same-sex marriage, I'm opposed to that at this time. I don't think that's the direction we need to head at this time. And if you go back, I'm the sponsor of a bill that would exempt Catholic charities, similar to what they do in the state of New York and Rhode Island, that would allow Catholic charities to continue to do the work that they're doing. And I think that's something we need in Illinois. I think the support for same-sex marriage is not there yet in this state. I really don't. And I think there's a lot of resentment still from what happened with the civil unions law and how that affected Catholic charities.
Is your opposition to it from a philosophical point or fiscal?
It's from both philosophical and fiscal.
Okay. What else are we going to see coming up in the legislation?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think more business incentives for our state. I think what happened with Caterpillar, the fact that they announced they're building this plant in Georgia, we have to look at companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, ADM, the fact that they are building new plants in other states, whether it's Georgia, Arkansas, Texas. The main reason is workers' compensation costs in our state, regulation, and taxes. And, you know, workers' compensation reform, which is something that the chairman of Caterpillar has talked about relentlessly with Governor Quinn and our legislative leaders, that has to be a part of it. We're not going to grow this economy in Illinois with more government spending. We have to have a private sector growth. And I think those three things, workers' compensation reform, less regulation, and lowering our taxes will help grow the private sector.
Okay. Darren, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and I hope we were able to give you some valuable information on what the General Assembly did in its recent session and what to expect going forward. Remember, you can see today's show as well as past episodes on our website, thepeorian.com, and be sure to join us next week here on WHOY.
Música